we're up to John chapter 18, and we're picking up where we left off in the 25th verse of that chapter, looking at the religious trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Now, as we talked about last week, there were three trials of Jesus. The synoptics are more interested in giving a comprehensive historical breakdown of these trials, particularly Luke, looking at the religious trial, what amounted to a Herodian trial, which was essentially a kind of custody hearing or a jurisdiction hearing, whether Jesus should be tried as a Galilean or if he should be tried as a Judean. And then finally, of course, imperial trial under Pontius Pilate. John, unlike the synoptics, is more focused on the Hebraic aspect of the trials of Jesus. He looks at the Sanhedrin trial, and he looks at the trial before Pilate, but he looks at that from the perspective of the influence of the Sanhedrin at it, and how the Sanhedrin were trying to get Jesus, of course, assassinated or executed by the Romans. They wanted what amounted to a theocratic assassination to appear to be a Roman execution, thinking Jesus would just be like one of thousands of other Jews who the Romans had executed without any reference to themselves. Now, it is true that the Romans did kill thousands and thousands of Jews under the Herodians and under others for essentially subterfuge, for rebellion, for insurrection, or even the threat of it against the Roman imperial authorities. That is all true. However, there was something unique about the trial of Jesus. The Romans, that is Pilate, found him innocent and found no grounds for such an execution of Jesus. We talked about this last week, the judicial review that took place by the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chaim Cohen, in the 1970s, that said the trial of Jesus was completely illegal by both Jewish and Roman law. Nonetheless, let's continue. We'll begin reading from verse 25 to the end of the chapter. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." At this point, the other apostles had fled or had gone. Simon, as we know, Simon Peter, followed at a distance. Simon Peter followed at a distance. Now we see certain characteristics in the Gospels about Peter. When he's called Cephas, which is the Latinization of Kaifa, meaning stone or pebble, small stone or pebble, it tends to be in a more positive light. When he's simply called Simon Peter, it is in a more negative light, or at best a neutral one. Here, however, he's called Simon Peter. Both names are used. Now, we know his father's name was probably Jonah. Jesus called him Shimon bar Yonah. So we know one of his names is also Simon, Shimon. We have a mixture of characteristics of Cephas, Simon, and just Peter. His old name was Peter. Remember, you see this phenomena throughout Scripture. It begins with Avram and Abraham. Jacob turned to Israel. Okay, we see it with Shaul of Tarsus turned to Paul. Okay, now we all have a new name in the book of life. It would appear in Scripture some people find out what it is before eternity. Well, Onesimus is another one. Onesimus is another one. His name meant useful in the Epistle of Philemon. You have this. When we study Jacob, for instance, in the book of Genesis, we see when he behaved like his old scheming self. Genesis calls him by his old name, Jacob. When he behaves like a spiritual man, representative of being a new creation, although he was not yet born again, his encounter with the Lord definitely illustrates a new creation. He's called Israel. Jacob and Israel. Jacob's name becomes a metaphor and a corporate solidarity for unbelieving Jews or for Israel. Jacob is always Judeo-centric, the time of Jacob's trouble. It is his old nature that personifies the Jewish people as yet unredeemed. That is Jacob. It is his new persona and identity, Israel, that represents redeemed Israel. Redeemed Israel. Again, this goes back to Abraham, the father of many nations. Okay? Well, we see this with Peter. We see that he's sometimes referred to as the stone or the pebble, referring to the chips of rock at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus was, of course, the rock, the foundation stone, not Peter. We have a teaching explaining this. And we have a video filmed on locations showing how situationally absurd the Roman Catholic contention that Peter was the rock upon which the church would be built is. You can't build a rock on a Petros, only on a Petra. And Peter was not the Petra, he was the Petros. Okay. But Jesus changed his name. Okay. Well, when you see him in a positive light, it's generally dealing with the new Peter, with the Cephas. But when you see Peter, Petros, it isn't. But this gets more complicated with him. He can be a complicated figure. Look with me, please, to the book of Galatians. Chapter 2, verse 11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. He behaved hypocritically with relation or with regard to non-Jewish Christians before Jewish believers who were observant and remaining observant under the law. We see that even the new creation can exhibit defects, and characteristics of the old. There is always a mixture of the old and the new. This is most visible in Jacob in the Old Testament, and the same pattern is most visible in Peter in the New Testament. In you and in I, we will exhibit, we will manifest displays of conduct, of behavior, where at times we behave like new creations, and at other times the old man and the old woman would come through. And unlike Peter, it could be when there's some kind of social pressure involved or a fear of man involved. Again, these people are pictures of us. They are pictures of us. We see Queen Esther has two names, Hadassah, which is a myrtle plant, in Hebrew, but Esther. Esther is a Persian name, and it has the same root as the pagan goddess Ashtaroth. I'm not saying she was named after a pagan goddess, but it was as etymologically related to it. When you see the same person in either testament referred to by more than one name, it usually is in some way illustrating the old man or the old woman, the old creation, in contrast to the new one. And you will see a conflict of behavior within them. A conflict of behavior is manifested within them and exhibited by them because they are pictures of us. They are pictures of you and I. There is an old creation and there is a new one, but there is an ongoing conflict between the two. We live in a fallen world. In Ephesians, we are exhorted to see ourselves as seated with Christ in the heavenly places. That is the way Jesus was. He always saw his position on earth in light of and relative to his relationship with the Father in eternity. That's what he always did. He always looked up. Okay? He always looked up. The new creation always wants to look up, but the old creation will always look down. There's a conflict within us, and we see it in Peter. Now, Peter did what he did, but he didn't want to give up on Jesus. He was in a dangerous situation. He was afraid he'd be arrested and condemned too. On the other hand, he did not just run away. He followed at a distance. And that, of course, is what our conflicted nature does. The old creation has been crucified with Christ. That is true. We are new creations in him. We will not abandon our faith and deny it, but we will follow him at a distance. Now, if we continue to follow him at a distance, one of two things will happen. We will deny him as Peter did. In Gethsemane, at his arrest in Gethsemane, we are told in the Synoptics, and we are told elsewhere, something was happening with the agony of Jesus. And at one other point, Jesus told Peter, Satan wanted or wants or desires to sieve you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. Satan wants to sieve you and I like wheat. It is only the intercession of Christ that prevents this. We would wind up following at a distance, and when you follow at a distance, you get more distant. Or something happens by God's grace where you still can't stop following him. Now, of course, after the resurrection, Peter was fishing in Galilee, and we will come to that. And we see what happens when he confronts the Jesus he denied. But remember, the other apostles weren't there. The only one we know that stuck around was John. But Peter was in the middle. He wanted to leave, but he wanted to stay. He couldn't deny Jesus. At the same time, he couldn't stand next to him. This is not uncommon among backsliders. They could be in the world, they could be into sin, they could be into immorality, they could be into whatever it is. Yet they would still somehow profess to believe because they know it's the truth. And they would still have some kind of an aspiration to put their relationship with the Lord right. If it is purely a moral issue, that is one thing. But here it becomes a persecution issue. Remember, we looked at last week in Gethsemane, the young man who ran away naked without the garments of salvation, so it were. Many will fall away and betray one another. They'll leave, they'll go off, they will do this, they will do that. Others in persecution will follow at a distance. So when we read about Peter, understand we're not just reading about Peter. We are reading about ourselves, about the nature of all of us, both collectively and individually. This conflict is within us. The new creation and the old one, the new man and the old one, the new woman and the old one, the one called by the old name, one called by another name. But here we see a combination of names. Jesus calls Peter Simon when he calls him Shimon Bar Yonah, Simon's son of Jonah, remember? When in the book of Acts chapter 10, Peter is at Jaffa, South Tel Aviv, where it is today, the biblical port of Jaffa, and he doesn't want to go to the Gentiles. That is to Cornelius and his family. Well, it was at Jaffa, the same location, in the house of Simon the tanner where Peter was. Before that, Jonah was in Jaffa when he didn't want to go to Nineveh. He was in the character of Jonah. It was not just that Peter's father's name was Jonah. It went beyond that. The name meant something. So we see that when Peter is referred to as Simon, we see a guy who wants to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus. He wants to be a man of God, but he wants to do it on his terms, in accordance with his own understanding, his own preferences, and will resist the Lord. Wind up in the stomach of a great fish. The Lord will bring that correction to get us right. Peter was in that character. So you've got Petros, thou art Petros, and upon this, Kaifa, rock, I'll build my church. The new creation is built on Christ. The old one is a small stone, a chip of Petros. They're all over the ground at Caesarea Philippi, coming out of the water cave with the cascade in it. It was known as the gates of hell. I point you to that video where we explain it and film it on location. And it completely debunks the myth of the papacy, the Roman Catholic Convention. Anyway, you got Peter, and you've got Cephas, its Latin version. Okay, thou art Peter upon this rock. Okay, the new creation is always built on Christ. Okay, the old one, it's a little chip of stone. It doesn't make a very good foundation. You can't build a building on it. It's too small and too weak. Yet, there is that in all of us. There's the weak and the strong. The strong is that which is built on Christ, the rock. We can build on no other foundation. He is the rock of our salvation. The rock that was following them in Corinthians was Christ, we are told. Okay. So we have that which is on the rock, but that's absent from here. Here we don't see him called Caiaphas. He's not on the rock. We have him called Simon, which puts him in the character of Jonah, somebody who wants to follow the Lord on his own terms, according to his own understanding. There are believers who are like that. They have had a regeneration, a born-again experience at some point, but they begin making their own standards of discipleship that are not scriptural. I've seen this happen in a lot of places. Well, you know, they will date unsaved people. They will have unsaved friends, not just acquaintances or workmates or people they're trying to witness to. They will not just be in the world, but not of it, as we all should be, but they will become worldly Christians, although they know and somehow and believe the truth. They will say, I've got my own relationship with the Lord. I pray, I read the Bible, I don't go to church or fellowship or whatever. Well, wait a minute, forsake not the fellowshipping together one with another. But I've known Christians, even pre-COVID, even when there were good churches available, that didn't go to one, and that was their argument. I don't need the church, I just need the Lord. They argue with their own understanding. That was the character of Jonah. That was the character of Simon Peter. Well, here it is, Simon Peter. And he's warming himself. This mixed version of the old and new creation is always looking to warm itself. It is in hostile territory, the fallen world. We're surrounded by non-believers. The world is in the power of the wicked one. But there is this sense we should try to make some kind of security in the fallen world. This is not good. The world will turn against us sooner or later. Not only that, but the devil's going to come after us sooner or later, one way or another. But not only that, the Lord will allow it to bring about a repentance and a commitment in our own life. Okay. Jesus would later speak to Peter and John about his own martyrdom. And we would see, after God's grace worked in his life, he was a very different Peter, not warming himself. We want to warm up. We want to have it as good as we can in a fallen world. I understand that. I understand that. The question is, at what expense? At what expense? Are you willing to compromise what God says and to follow Christ at a distance to try to have it good in this world, or to try to get on in this world? Well, once you do that, you will begin to deny Jesus. He says, I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, being the relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off. Oh boy. His own deeds come back now. When he thought Jesus was going to be with him, and Jesus was going to get rid of the Romans, and Jesus was going to whatever, he was very brave because he was next to the tough guy. Not understanding substitutionary atonement or propitiation, that the strong one was going to become weak in our place because we are weak in order to atone for our sin. Peter didn't get that. And when he realizes that Jesus is not going to do that and be the strong guy until his return, then he begins to get proverbially cold feet And when your feet get cold, you want to get warm. Didn't I see you in the garden with him? Now, again, we talked about what in the garden represents. It goes back to the imagery of Genesis chapter 2 and 3, where man fell. Peter, therefore, denied it again, and immediately a cock crowed. There's a church on the traditional site of this called Peter and Gallicantru. Now, actually, it is a fairly valid biblical site, Peter and Gallicantru. It is a rather creepy Roman Catholic church, but it is a good geographical location. You can see Hakadama from it, the field of blood where Judas was, and you get a panorama of the lower city of David. It is indeed built in the area where we know from archaeology the high priest's palace was, the high priest's house was. And there are remains of a cobbled stairway that Jesus almost certainly would have walked on. There's not a lot where you can say Jesus stood here, but this is one of the places where it was and where he was held. I've been in it a number of times. It is underneath the Gallicantru. In the adjacent cemetery is where Oscar Schindler from Schindler's List is buried. He's buried in the church graveyard next to Gallicantru. We continue. They led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the Pretorium, in order that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. The Pretorium had pagan Roman imagery, idols, other gods, demonic, deified idols. And a Jew coming in contact with other gods would not be ritually clean to eat the Passover. The Praetorium was within the grounds of or immediately adjacent to the fortress Antonio. This location is also known. It is today called Lefasstrasse. Lefasstrasse. It is on the Via della Rosa, near the Ecce Homo Arch, and it is the opposite, the exit to the Rabbi's Tunnel, which parallels the Wailing Wall, underground portion of the Wailing Wall, going past where many believe the Holy of Holies actually was. All of these things are in close proximity to each other. As you come out, you go through a Hasmonean cistern, which held huge amounts of water for the temple, for the rinsing of the blood from the temple sacrifices. And you then continue out onto what is now called the Via della Rosa. Most archaeologists agree the present Via della Rosa, where the Stations of the Cross are, is not the original one, but they do know where it began approximately, at the Lefasstrasse. And you can still see the etchings of the Roman 10th Legion on the pavement stones. Now, we don't know if those are first century or a second century reconstruction of first century stones, just recycling the same stones where they played the circle game. That would look like you could gamble for someone's clothes there. Again, I've been there many times. If you've been to Jerusalem, you probably would have been to it. It is also not far from the hospital and the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed the paralytic in John 5. All these things are quite close. They're literally within 10 to 15 minutes walk from each other. Okay. That is where the Praetorium was, on the north side of the Temple Mount, with the Fortress Antonio overlooking the Jewish temple and having these pagan ensigns and Roman eagles towering over the house of God. It was an affront to their national identity. To have gone in there would be ritually defiling. Pilate therefore went out to them into the courtyard, into something, one of the places called Agabata, a paved plaza. And he went out there and he begins to address them. He said, "What accusation do you bring against this man? Hence, behold the man," in Latin, ecce homo. We have a first century arch at the beginning of the Via della Rosa, where the Lathasstrasse is, and it's called the Ecce Homo Arch. Behold the man. What do you bring against him? And they answered and said, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Notice they don't get specific about the charges. They just don't like him. So they trump stuff up and try to amplify the allegations into some kind of an indictment. Now, notice how this happens. Let me explain. The Herodians were de facto Romans politically. The Herodians were de facto Romans. The Pharisees were anti-Roman, in theory. The Zealots, the Sikkim, as Josephus called them, were militantly anti-Roman. I point this out for a reason we'll come to shortly. The Essenes, they were against the Romans, against the Pharisees, against the Sadducees. They were against the Herodians. They were out in the desert. They saw the whole system as corrupt, and they were in part right. Unfortunately, their own beliefs were not exactly scriptural. But then we have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was dominated by Sadducees. If you don't know, we have a teaching called the Sons of Zadok. They were the only priestly family that was not corrupted. We read about God's prophetic purposes for them in a positive sense in the book of Ezekiel. The Tzadokim, the sons of Zadok, or the Zadokites. They were righteous initially, but they became corrupted during the intertestamental period, in the Hasmonean period, the time between the prophet Malachi and John the Baptist. That 400 plus year period was crucial in bringing about changes politically and in the religious realm that framed the background of the Sitzumleben, of the cultural life setting that the gospel would take place in the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus. One king, John Hyrcanus, had been a high priest who made himself a king, which was unscriptural. They began vying for political power. The Jews were caught up in a conflict between Rome and the Parthians. The Parthians were the Persians. Although the Persians were defeated by Alexander the Great, they made a regional resurgence. They were never the top gun again, the top power again. They never were that again, but they were a formidable regional power against the Romans. That is a whole involved story itself, and it is important to understand that background to a degree to fully grab the context of the book of Daniel and the Gospels. So the whole thing with the Parthians, and there were Jews in Parthia. We know this from Acts chapter 2. Parthians were Persians. Today we call them Iranians. At various times, the Persians the Farsi and Parthian, today Iranian. They were Aryans. These were Indo-European people. They were not Semites like Jews and Arabs. They were anthropological cousins, of course, of the Germanic people that lived in the Middle East. They were Europeans who lived in the Middle East. These are the Iranians. But then they were called Parthians. And there was this whole conflict with them in Rome. They almost withstood Rome, basically, for 300 years. They and the Romans didn't want to fight with each other because they knew they would damage each other significantly. And the Israelites made alliances with Rome to protect their interests. This happens with the general Pompey, who's a type of the Antichrist to enter the Holy of Holies. It's important to understand how Pilate got there. The Hebrews, the Israelites, made a treaty with the Romans and invited them in as a protector. They were looking to the power of Rome to protect them instead of to God. This is something that at an earlier point in Isaiah 30 and 31, God had warned about in the days of King Hezekiah. Stop looking to Egypt to protect you from Assyria. Stop looking for the protection of Egypt. Isaiah 30 and 31. Well, they would look to the protection of Rome. They got more than they bargained for when Pompey, the famous general from the triumvirate, entered the Holy of Holies. Again, a major type of the Antichrist. The Jews will make this treaty that will backfire on them and they will be betrayed. We address this at some length in the book I authored, Shadows of the Beast. Shadows of the Beast. It's important to understand this. This chapter is crucial to understanding the emergence of Antichrist from a Jewish perspective. What we just read is crucial to understanding the emergence of Antichrist from a Jewish perspective. I will explain it as we go along. So, once more, you've got these Sadducees. Their ancestors were good. They began right, but they became corrupted. They were very much to the Judaism of the Second Temple period what liberal Protestants are today. They denied a literal resurrection. They denied the supernatural. They denied the angelic. They also rejected the oral law held by the Pharisees. That was their only good point. They would not give doctrinal authority to the oral law, what became Talmudic Judaism. But they were anti-supernaturalist rationalists who were not interested in an afterlife. They were not interested in resurrection or spiritual power or the miraculous. This made them extremely hostile in their relationship to the Pharisees. Now, there are two ongoing aspects of the Sadducees, at least that we have to be aware of today. One of which is the conflict, the kind of conflict you see within the Jewish community and within Talmudic Judaism between the Reform Jews who are theologically liberal. They call their synagogues temples. They saw initially the Promised Land as the United States. It began in the United States. Their first temple was in Charleston, South Carolina. Their big one is New York, Fifth Avenue, Temple Emmanuel. They only became Zionistic because of the Holocaust. and its aftermath. They believed the promised land was the United States. They were very much diasporic Jews, and they saw a home in the diaspora. But they were theologically liberal. They followed theological liberalism, higher criticism, and the rest of it. They are at odds with the Orthodox. The Orthodox were also divided between the Kabbalistic Orthodox, that is the Hasidic movement, who believed in Jewish mysticism, and the non-Kabbalistic, who didn't really deny everything in Kabbalah, but didn't emphasize it. The best way to understand this conflict would be to compare it to the conflict between cessationist Christians and charismatic Christians or Pentecostals. Okay? The Kabbalistic, the Hasidic ones would be more charismatic. They would believe in manifestations that were divine. They pursued something called zooms, holy sparks. They still do. They're very experiential in their theology as well as Talmudic. They had one emphasis. The other Orthodox resisted this. Now, this goes into Jewish history, and there's big explanations for it. It had to do with when the rabbis proclaimed Shabbatai Tzvi and Jacob Frank to be the Messiah, and he turned out not to be. And Judaism became very stoic. And in reaction to the stoicism, where only wealthy Jews could afford to send their sons to yeshivas, the poor people of the shtetls of Europe became alienated from their faith, and the Hasidic movement blossomed among them. Again, sociologically, much the way as Pentecostalism blossomed among working class people. Okay? Or early Methodism blossomed among working class people. But they were sensual, emotional, whatever you want to call it. You had this conflict among the Orthodox between, as it were, the Kabbalistic and the non-Kabbalistic, broadly comparable to the conflict between evangelicals who are Pentecostal and charismatic and those who are not. They were forced to join forces, however, against Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism was influenced by higher criticism, the same as liberal Protestantism. It was influenced by the diasporic culture that was influenced by Gentile culture. So the Orthodox saw this as the Hellenism that influenced Jews in the direction of Greek culture in the times of the Maccabees and of Antiochus Epiphanes. They saw it as replaying that, a Hellenization. It was seen as a big threat to the Reform movement. Not only that, it was philosophically influenced by the Dutch Jewish philosopher Spinoza, whose ideas Einstein's pretty much subscribed to, of God as a cosmic intelligence, as a creative cosmic intelligence. Well, with the Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment, called the Haskalah, that was pioneered by, of all people, the grandfather of the Jewish Christian composer Felix Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, who many people consider to be the greatest composer since Mozart, was a Jew who was a believer, a saved believer. The composer Mahler and the composer Mendelssohn were two believing Jews who were born-again believers. But the grandfather of Mendelssohn was the primary founder of the Haskalah. I've explained this before on other recordings. And with this, the rabbis no longer controlled Jewish learning. You began to see Jews entering professions and becoming scientists and professors and economists and going into these various fields and prospering in secular education. This was a big threat to the Orthodox, to the point where the Hasidic and the ordinary Orthodox formed an alliance called Agudat Israel against the liberals. This is much the same as where you will see both charismatics and non-charismatics, people like MacArthur and charismatics agreeing against liberal Protestantism, against the kind of churches that Kamala Harris was speaking in, as opposed to churches, that were evangelical, whatever that term means now. This kind of thing, this kind of same conflict took place in Judaism. So the Sadducees were, for that time, what Reform Judaism is for now. I hope I'm not boring you. The other thing is, the Sadducees were, for that time, what Calvinistic Christians are for now. The Sadducees were determinists. They believed in Allah before Muhammad or before Islam. The Pharisees believed all is foreseen by God, but the choice is given. Jesus was closer to the Pharisaical way of thinking on a number of issues, including that one. He said concerning Judas, the Son of Man must be betrayed, for it is written. But woe to him by whom he is betrayed, with reference to Judas. So you had this conflict between the Calvinistic Inja-Allah type of Jews and the ones who were not. These things still exist. The conflict is in Christianity. The conflict is between Christianity and Islam. The conflict is between, Calvinists and non-Calvinists. But these things existed in Judaism before anything in either the Christian or Islamic world. It's important to understand this in understanding the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were not as Roman as the Herodians, who simply held Judaism as a religion of political convenience. However, to protect their own interests and advance their own cause, they would play ball with the Romans. It was not uncommon for them to pay money and bribes, to pay what would later be called simony or simony to the Roman authorities to appoint the high priest. Now you'd say, what business do pagan Roman authorities have over appointing the high priest for Israel? The Torah gave instruction they are to be of Aaronic descent, from the tribe of Levi, etc. What is it to these secular authorities, let alone pagan ones? Again, there's nothing new under the sun. This very week, as we speak, the hypocrisy and corruption of somebody I call in Justin Sickby, better known as Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury was exposed. I have no doubt that his exposure, as I will be addressing on Word for the Weekend on RTN, had to do in part with his anti-Israel bias and placation of Islam against Israel and Zionism. He compromised as a theocratic politician, being the Archbishop of Canterbury, on homosexual and lesbian ordination, appointing women as vicars and bishops, and on same-sex marriage. He's a reprehensible, disgusting person. Yet he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the ecclesiastical head of the Church of England. Not in the House of Commons, but in the House of Lords. You have the Lords and the Lords temporal and the Lords ecclesiastical. There are bishops in the House of Lords, the upper house of the British Parliament, which are also part of the judicial system and under the British parliamentary system of government. The Commons, however, like the Congress, these are politicians, vote to appoint or approve the Archbishop of Canterbury. You couldn't make this up. So you have a socialist prime minister, members of parliament who are Freemasons, who are Muslims, a number of them are now Muslims, Hindus, Roman Catholics, rank unbelievers, voting on who's going to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. They're going to have to appoint a new one because Welby was forced to resign for protecting sadistic pedophiles. Much in the character of what you see in the Roman Catholic Church. Same kind of thing. The hierarchy protecting pedophiles, sex criminals. Well, why is it? How can it be in a Christian nation that you've got members of parliament who are Muslims, who are Masons, who are Roman Catholics, who are not even Anglicans, not Church of England, who are nothing, who are atheists, voting who's going to be the Archbishop? It sounds ridiculous. Well, it is. But it is not new. It's exactly what was going on in John chapter 18. We do not simply study these scriptures to know what did happen. We study these scriptures to understand within a theologically and doctrinally and historically correct framework not only what did happen, but what is happening and what is going to happen. If we are not studying these things in order to understand what did happen, in order to correctly understand what is happening and what is going to happen, we are wasting our time. It is pointless head knowledge or something like that. No, you have to understand what the Sadducees were in the Sanhedrin to understand what's happening now. The Sanhedrin are like the Synod. So now the Anglicans are having their Synod because of the crisis with Welby, and the Catholics the previous week had a Synod because of the crisis with Pope Francis. Unbelievable. It goes on. These things are not new. To understand what's happening now in the Anglican world, the Protestant world, the Catholic world, begin by understanding John 18 or the Gospels, the New Testament. The story progresses. The Sanhedrin, if he wasn't bad, we wouldn't have told you he was. Now you understand they politically buddied up to each other. They'd find some ridiculous charge. I'm in New York. Take a look out the window. Okay. I'm only looking at something happening here. Donald Trump wanted to build some skyscrapers. That's his business. You need capital financing. One of the banks, the main bank he spoke to for one project was Deutsche Bank, a German-owned bank, the American branch of a German-owned bank. And he put up collateral. The bank looked at the collateral, and it was for them to do due diligence and say, we believe that this is adequate collateral to lend the money, which they did. They gave him the loans. He built the skyscrapers. He repaid the loans with interest. There was no problem. The bank got their money with interest. The skyscrapers were built. Going back a number of years, his political enemies decide that, no, he inflated, he overstated the value of the collateral. Well, the bank that lent them the money didn't think so. But in New York, if you want to indict a conservative, you can walk down the street and get a jury ready to do it in 10 minutes. It's absurd. It's something that in another state would never be even considered. A DA who lets violent criminals out of prison, who are recidivists, they commit violent crimes, when he lets them out without bail. Yet, for political reasons, he went after Trump. Now, Alan Dershowitz, who describes himself as a liberal Democrat, said this is ridiculous. Professor emeritus from Harvard, truly one of America's great legates, jurists, not jurists, but legal minds. Well, this kind of corruption, we'll just find anything. We'll embellish anything. You've got some political motive, so you can weaponize the legal system to go after somebody. Here they had a theocratic motive. We saw this emerge in John chapter 11 with the resurrection of Lazarus. Their power was threatened. So they had no basis to do anything about Jesus doctrinally. So they had to get him legally and weaponize the legal system. So they go to the Romans. The Sadducees would pay the Romans, they would get in bed with the Romans and pursue a prosecution that had no legal basis. Pilate knew it had no legal basis. Now, I'm not saying this to vindicate Donald Trump. I'm simply using that current example to explain what was happening here in the text. Same kind of thing. People trying to preserve power for themselves and using what has come to be known as lawfare to do it. That's what we're talking about. So they go to Pilate. Hey, look, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you if we didn't have a reason. Yeah, what's the reason? Some trumped up nonsense. Pilate knew it was trumped up and wanted to throw it out. But there was political pressure. Oh, we have no king but Caesar. They hated Caesar, but they hated Jesus more. They hated their own Messiah more than they hated Caesar. This politically pressures Pilate to do something. A prosecution he didn't want anything to do with. Now, we read about his character as a person in Josephus. The way Josephus describes Pilate is very much the political animal that you see in the Gospels. He operates that way. It's interesting to read what Josephus said about Pilate. Pilate, therefore, verse 31, take him yourselves and judge him according to your Torah, your law. But the Jews, meaning the religious establishment, the Judeans, the Sanhedrin, dominated by the Sadducees, said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. Now, at times they did it, but they're appealing to Roman law. That the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was to die. This is not recorded in John. It is recorded in Mark 10:33, Matthew 20:18-19, and Luke 18:32-33. It is in the synoptics. Let's just look at Mark 10:33 very briefly. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will deliver him to the Gentiles. Now notice, although John's gospel is quite different structurally and in its thematic emphasis than the synoptics, there is a harmony, and John will cite things not found in John, in the text of John, but which are found in the synoptics. It shows there is a harmony between the two, not a contradiction as some liberal higher critics have tried to suggest. Okay. Now, of course, what they did not see is that in Romans, it had to be done that way. Look with me, please, to the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 2. Verse 9, there'll be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, to the Jew first and also the Greek. Jew and Greek, Jew and Gentile. Greek meaning Gentile. But also now, let's look at Peter's second kerygma in the book of Acts, chapter 4, verse 27. For truly in this city, Jerusalem, there were gathered together against thy holy servant Jesus, Yeshua, whom thou didst anoint. That Messiah means anointed one, Mashiach, Jesus, whom thou didst anoint, both Herod and Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. Notice, it was the Romans, the Herodians, the people of Israel, the religious establishment. There was a joint corporate responsibility for what happened to Jesus. Obviously, it was the will of the Lord to smite him. Obviously, he took our sins voluntarily, said, I lay my life down. However, in terms of judicial responsibility, factual responsibility for the conspiracy, it involved the Sanhedrin, the Romans, the Jews, the Gentiles, the Herodians, the whole gamut. And that's what you see here in John 18. They're all involved in it. You can't pin the whole thing on the Romans. You can't pin the whole thing on the Jews. You can't pin the whole thing on anybody because he died for everybody. Therefore, because he would die for everybody, Jew and Gentile, and bring salvation to both Jew and Gentile, both Jew and Gentile had to be complicit in his death. Okay? Jew and Gentile had to be complicit in his death because he would die for all. That is what the prophecy of Mark 10:33 is talking about, as well as Matthew 20:18 and 19, and Luke 18:32 and 33, as referred to in John 18:32. Pilate, therefore, entered again into the Pretorium and summoned Jesus. Now, by summoning Jesus into the Pretorium, you understand what was happening. He became ritually defiled. He became ritually defiled. Are you king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? You're a Roman. What do you care about if I'm, Pilate answered, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done? And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Whether the Reconstructionists, Calvinists like it or not, whether the New Apostolic Reformation likes it or not, whether then the Restorationists of England like it or not, whether then the Theonomic Reconstructionists like it or not, his kingdom is not of this world. Dominionism, triumphalism, we're going to conquer the world for Christ, set up his kingdom, then he's going to come, is not true. It has never been true. And those who have taught it have done nothing but error. This is one of the reasons that the Reformation became a fiasco in England and Scotland and continental Europe. It's one of the reasons for the mess you saw in Zwingli's Zurich and Calvin's Geneva and in Puritan England and in Salem, Massachusetts. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting. Again, you had the 7 Years' War. You had the war between the English Puritan Calvinists and the Scottish Presbyterian Calvinists. You had the Crusades. War upon war upon war, perpetrated in the name of Christianity. He said, if his kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. Now notice his servants were also Jewish. This underscores once more that when it says Jews, it doesn't mean people who were Jewish. It meant the Judean religious establishment in the context. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. It is of the earth, but not of the world. Pilate said to him, so you're a king? Jesus replies, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. If you are of the truth, you will believe the gospel. People who do not believe the gospel are not of the truth. They're not of the truth. He is the truth. People who do not believe in Jesus are in some way believing in and trusting in a lie. It could be a great intellectual like Bertrand Russell. It doesn't matter who it is. It could be anybody. If they do not believe the truth of Jesus, they are believing a lie. I think of the pop singer Patti Smith singing, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. She signs her own death warrant. I don't mean biological death. She condemns herself to hell. Unless by some miracle of God she repents. Pilate said to him, what is truth? The world will always question the nature of truth. There's no consistency in their definition of truth. People have tried to formulate a definition of absolute truth. The German philosopher Hegel said, the real is the rational, and the rational is the real. This was appropriated, if not expropriated, by Karl Marx and applied to his theory of dialectic materialism, the basis of communist thought. The real is the rational, and the rational is the real. Well, those who subscribe to this tend to say, there's no God, there's evolution. But wait a minute. Rationally, information cannot come from a vacuum. Genomes are coded information. Billions and billions of lines of coded information with nucleotide sequencing, incredibly complicated mathematically. That's just the human genome. The whole biosphere. It is not rational to say information did not have a pre-existing intelligence. Information science admits information cannot come from a vacuum. If you're going to write a code that can write other codes, somebody had to write the initial code. Artificial intelligence had to begin with human intelligence. Had there not been a pre-existing human intelligence, there couldn't be any AI. It's not rational. Okay. It's not rational to abort a baby with no medical reason at 40 weeks gestation. Abortus provocatus, and not call it murder, infanticide. They try to say things. The real is the rational is the real. They're not rational. They're not rational. Now, our faith is reasonable. When you really look at it, the only thing that is totally reasonable once you understand it is the Word of God. Everything else will be philosophically and logically contradictory as a system. They can call it situational ethics. They can call it anything they want. I recall when the unbelieving Jewish scientist Jonas Salk was interviewed on television in my youth. Invented the cure for poliomyelitis, inoculation for polio. He said he believed in evolution, but he couldn't explain why He's looking for cures for diseases when those diseases are supposed to kill people according to a Darwinistic worldview. Why save the whale? Why protect endangered species? If they can't adapt to a changing environment, they weren't meant to. It's survival of the fittest. Notice the same people who are talking about save the planet or global warming or protecting endangered species will not care about protecting a human fetus and cannot explain to you the logical basis of their motive if they held or hold to a Darwinistic view of existence. They're supposed to become extinct. Unbelievable. What is truth? The world does not know what truth is. It cannot understand reality. Now let's look. And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews who couldn't come into the Praetorium, standing at or overlooking perhaps the Gabbatha. I find no guilt in him. There's no criminal basis for this. Now, again, we have to go to the Passion narratives and the synoptics to get the entire background. John is only focused on the conflict between Jesus and the religious establishment. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you wish that I release for you the King of the Jews? Therefore they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. And again, the Sanhedrin was stirring the people up to say this. Now, Barabbas was a robber. We know who the high priest was and who his father-in-law was and who his family were. This was Caiaphas. And we know something from history about what happened to Caiaphas and his family. It is quite interesting. Lucius Vitellius, also known as Lucius the Elder, he deposed Caiaphas in 36 or 37 AD, Common Era, and then he died in 46. When it became politically expedient, the Romans deposed him. Another member of his family, Ananos, was assassinated or killed by the Romans in 66. No, I'm sorry, was killed in 66 by the Jews. He was killed by the Jews because he wanted to make peace with the Romans. The Sanhedrin wanted to make peace with the Romans. And when the uprising began to take shape, they killed him. He was the one who was responsible for the stoning of James the Just, the brother of Jesus. He was deposed from power by Agrippa II, according to history. We know about the father-in-law, Annas, the father-in-law. The house of Caiaphas fell. They all died under the judgment of God. Their own people turned against them. The Romans turned against them. But let's look at the figure of Barabbas. I would not want to use the term a double typology. It's better to explain it than perhaps try to invent an arbitrary term to define it. In Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, you've got two goats. The Azazel represents the devil. And the Azazel, by the time of Jesus, was killed at a latter point after being taken out into the wilderness. It represents the destruction, the final judgment of Satan. First, the goat that's for the Lord, corresponding to Christ, is killed, but then the Azazel is killed in the wilderness. That's why there's a future prophetic meaning to Yom Kippur. It was only partially fulfilled in the first coming of Christ. However, there is what we might call a typological application in addition. That one goat died while the other was set free. Well, it was, but it kept coming back, or it came back, so they killed it. It's an application. One dies, one goes free. But the interpretation is that the Azazel will be destroyed after the blood of the goat for the Lord is applied in the Holy of Holies, as we see in Hebrews chapter 9. You've got an interpretation and an application. I've got no problem with the application, but we should not confuse it with the interpretation. The Azazel is the devil, not us. So too here, we have a similar situation in Barabbas. By way of application, we may say that Jesus, the true Son of the Father, Barabbas, Bar, Aramaic son, Bar in Aramaic is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew Ben, son. Bar, Ben, Bar Abbas, son of the Father. Ben Abba, Bar Abbas, son of the Father. We can say that Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Father turned his back on the Son so we could become the children of God. That is a perfectly valid truth, and it is an application of the saga of Barabbas that is not problematic doctrinally or theologically. However, it goes well beyond that in terms of interpretation. Jesus is the Son of the Father. He is the Bar Ben Abba, Bar Abbas. You have this other person with the same name claiming to be the Son of the Father. Now, this other person was a zealot, like Simon the Zealot, a political radical. However, these political radicals, who Josephus usually described as the Sikkim, which has to do like with the stabbers, they were something like the provisional IRA as opposed to the traditional IRA of Michael Collins. The traditional IRA of Michael Collins were partisans. They were not terrorists. The Provisional IRA were terrorists. They were gangsters. They did things the traditional IRA would not have done, like put a bomb in a shopping mall and kill children in Omagh, Ireland, or things of this nature, or oppress their own people. They're just people using a political and religious banner for what amounts to organized crime and thuggery, much the same as the Protestant paramilitaries did the same thing. They were not real partisans. They were gangsters engaging in social terror against their own communities. That is the way Josephus described the Sikkim. We are told Barabbas was a letrese, a plunderer, not a kleptos, like kleptomaniac, not a thief who sneaks in and steals away, not a burglar. This is somebody who is a smash and grab looter. A smash and grab looter. You see what's happening in cities in the United States like Chicago and San Francisco. Progressivist politicians have legalized crime, declining to prosecute people who don't steal at least $1,000 worth of merchandise. They won't arrest them. They legalize crime. And if somebody does get arrested, these DAs who are often funded by George Soros, and I'm not being political here, I'm just stating what's happening to understand what the Sikkim were like, we'll let them go without bail. You're legalizing crime. And this was carried out in the name of liberation. Black Lives Matter, $95 million worth of contributions have disappeared. Money given to help the urban poor. 95 million. They found Patrisse Cullors. Unbelievable. She lives in an area in Topanga Canyon, north of Los Angeles, where there's no black people, only white ones, and that's one of 4 homes she's got. She is a multimillionaires. Leader of Black Lives Matter. Unbelievable. The top guys are profiting from the people they're claiming to be fighting to liberate. The Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, the same thing. The top guys are like mafia dons. They're profiting from the people they profess to be liberating. This kind of hypocrisy. It's always been around. The Sikkim were the same way in the time of Josephus and in the time of Barabbas. They would oppress their own people. Josephus writes about this during the siege of Jerusalem extensively. They were more oppressive than the Romans. I've watched a film clip of Hamas torturing their own people, torturing Arabs, torturing them. Nobody says anything. The IRA kneecaps, nobody says anything. Yet they always do this stuff in the name of liberation or even religion. This is what Barabbas was from the Zealots. We have two people claiming to be the Son of the Father. At the behest of their religious leadership, the Jews of Jerusalem said, "Give us Barabbas." They chose the false Son of the Father over the true one. Barabbas is a major type of Antichrist. Remember, John is always punctuated with references to what's going to happen at the close of the age. There's no Olivet Discourse. There's this continual punctuation of texts where things are revealed about the close of the age. The Antichrist and the false prophet. The false prophet will play a role with the backing of the rabbinic establishment in proclaiming the Antichrist, the son of Mashiach, as the Messiah, a false son of the Father, rejecting the true son of the Father. Give us the false one. The religious establishment, in league with the false prophet, will replay this. What has happened here will be replayed. Only, of course, it will not be the physical body of Yeshua, of Jesus, who faces crucifixion. It'll be his body, the body of Christ. The same as Jesus' body was crucified, the body of Jesus, the body of Christ. Same as the body of Christ was crucified in the gospel, the body of Christ will face crucifixion at the close of the age. There will be a rescue, but not a pre-trib rescue. Barabbas must be known. Give us Barabbas. Now, it will not only be the Jews who accept the false son of the Father. Backslidden Christendom, the apostate church, the harlot church will go the same way. But having rejected the true Messiah, unbelieving Jews have always followed false ones. This includes Simon Bar Kokhba, Jacob Frank, Shabbatai Tzvi, Menachem Schneerson, and multiple others. Judah of Galilee, named by Rabbi Gamaliel in Acts 5, but one of them is Barabbas. The first one is Barabbas. Claims to be the son of the Father. Rejecting the true son, they will follow a false one, and will do so at the behest of their own religious leaders. We will see another Barabbas.